Hello, everyone, and welcome to Y2Y for the month of May. I know we're doing this on June 2nd, but it was a crazy end of the month last month, so we're doing it here in the first week of June. So we'll still do one at the end of June, but welcome everyone who is listening and everyone who is watching. We have a great program today. We're going to talk about using the Y with different assessments, and we're going to talk specifically about 3 different assessments: the Kolbe, the DISC, and the core values index. And in order to talk about those, we brought some experts and some people who use the Y and these other assessments together. And we also have one of our former podcast guests, or I guess current podcast guests, because you can still go to our site to see him, that actually brought the question to mind when I was working with one of our new coaches, James Madison. We have an experienced coach in Nicole Tobiassen that's going to join us, and another experienced coach in Kelley, Lujan. So we have a really great program planned for you guys. So I'm going to bring them all in one at a time, and I'm going to introduce them as I bring them in. So let's bring in our first guest today that's going to help in the conversation, and that's Kelley Lujan. She's the COO at Elevation 180. Her why is right way, her how is clarify, and her what is trust. So welcome, Kelley.
Thanks for having me, Dan. I'm excited to be here.
I'm so glad that you are here to provide expertise. You and Elevation 180, Jerry, use the Y and the Kolbe so effectively that I want to definitely get your perspective today. So thank you for being on with us today.
Awesome. Yeah, excited to be here. Yeah. Oh, are you going to bring everyone on, or should I just...
Yeah, we're going to bring everybody on. So let's bring on Gina. Gina Balarin is calling all the way in from Australia. She's in the future, guys. She is calling in from Thursday morning, and her why is make sense, her how is challenge, and her what is better way. So Gina comes to us as the originator of this. You know, we were having a conversation, me and another coach were talking about how we use the why with other assessments, and literally a few minutes later I get an email from Gina, and she says, Dan, I'm having trouble mapping the why to the DISC. Can you help out? I said, not only can I help out, we're going to do a show about this. So, Gina, thank you for originating this idea.
Oh, it's my pleasure. But I would say that you guys kind of originated already. I'm just making sense of what was there already. And to that point, we'll cover this more in detail. But effectively, what's interesting about the strength that we have with the why is that sometimes they can also be the weaknesses. And so part of the acknowledging what our why is and starting with the why is being able to identify that when we have a very strong why, sometimes my ability to not make sense of things actually can completely scupper me. And sometimes the strength of the why, also when you acknowledge it, can be the weakness, but you have to go, hey guys, help me out. And that's exactly what we're doing here.
Fantastic. And yeah, because you wanted to make sense of it, right?
Exactly.
It wasn't making sense. So you went to the experts, and unfortunately, you got me. Sorry about that, Gina, but I brought some experts together for you. Our next guest is James Madison. He's an executive and leadership coach at On Purpose Life. He is one of our newest additions to the Y team. His why is to find a better way. His how is to simplify, and his what is to contribute. And of course, when I asked James if he would help, his contribute kicked in, and he said, yeah, I'm in, Dan. You know, he's really just starting out with this, but look at the poster on his wall. That was there before he met me. So, James, welcome.
Absolutely, Dan. And when we met, I told you you had me at Y, and so I'm in.
We got a great post out of that. Thanks so much for doing that, James. I really appreciate it. And welcome. We're gonna have a great conversation today with Gina, who is going to talk about DISC, and then our next guest is actually Nicole Tobiassen. She's a local. She's an Albuquerque gal, and she's right here in Albuquerque. She's with Action Coach. Her and her husband run that practice here in Albuquerque. Her why is challenge. And if we ask Gary and her husband, let's say her how and her what are challenge, but her how is actually clarify, and her what is make sense. And she is an amazing coach. I've had a chance to see her work with her team. She is dynamic, an extremely well-versed coach, and especially in the area of DISC. She is master certified DISC trainer. Did I get that right, Nicole?
You sure did, yeah.
So thank you and welcome, Nicole.
Thank you. Well, when you approached me with being a guest today, I was so excited because when I went through the Y training over a year ago, all I could think the entire time I was sitting there is like, oh my gosh, there's DISC in all of these. And so as I was writing my notes, I started writing down, what profile, what language I thought would fit with DISC and why. And I came up with this confusion at first. And I wanted to make sense of it all. I wanted to clarify it all, right? Yeah. And I think I've gotten a little bit closer. So I'm excited about the conversation today.
Well, thanks for being here. I'm glad you stepped up. We actually had put the show together, and then I run into Mark at an event, and Mark says, oh, you got to talk to Nicole. And Nicole was so flexible. Thank you for making time to be with us today, because we kind of got you with about a week's notice. So great that you're here. And, one of the things I like to do, because I know that there are people that are watching for the first time, maybe just don't know what the whys are. So I like to always start with that. So the 9 whys are, and I want to give a brief introduction. Contribute. Contribute is the first one. It's the one where these are people that want to contribute to the success of others in everything that they do. And so we recognize them as the team players, right? Number 2 is trust. These are people that for them, trust is the most important thing. If they trust you and you trust them, sky's the limit. Makes sense. We have Gina here, whose why is makes sense. So when you're a makes sense, you can take a lot of information and you want to make sense of it. And if you don't, you go look for the experts and you find a way to make sense of it. They love to solve problems. So that makes sense. The next one is better way. Our founders' why and James's why. People with this why are always looking to find better ways to do just about everything, from brushing your teeth to the fuel that fuels the space shuttle. They're going to figure out a better way to do things. So that's better way. In the middle between better way and challenge, we have right way. So these are people that love to do things the right way. They love patterns. They love processes. They love systems that deliver reliable results. We might have somebody with that why with us today. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the next one is challenge. That's Nicole. People with this why are the people that always say, why do we have to do it that way? They're the ones that give us fresh perspectives, look at things differently, and they're the ones that change things for the better most of the time. Sometimes the better way, people say, we change it for the better. The challenge is change it just to change it. So we'll have some conversation around that too. The next one is clarify. People with the why of clarify want to make sure that they're clear on everything that they do. So they're the ones that ask a lot of questions. When you work with them, you recognize them because they write long emails, they ask a lot of questions, and they won't move forward until they're clear. So that's how we recognize clarifies. Next one is simplify. People with the why of simplify are people who like to simplify things. They're the ones that are great at communicating complex things really simply. So they make great communicators. And then the last one is mastery. People with the why of mastery love knowledge. They love seeking mastery and knowledge. They love learning topics just for the sake of learning. And you recognize them when you meet them because you ask them a simple question and they'll talk for half an hour if it's something they know about. So those are the 9 whys. That's your brief update on that. And let's just get into some questions. You guys ready? All right. So I'm going to start with each one of you. Just give us a little bit. What other assessment are you using? So Kelley, I kind of gave it away a little bit. Tell me how you use the Kolbe with the why.
Yeah, so we use the Kolbe A index as our cognitive assessment. So we believe that there are 3 parts of the mind. So when our practice, we use affective. For the why assessment is our affective assessment. The why discovery. It's where you find all your intrinsic motivation. So the affective part of the mind is your feelings, your beliefs, and all of that motivation. So when you know that so crystal clear, like you can with the why discovery, it just kicks everything off. Your whole decision-making process starts there. So that's why we say it's the essential first step, because when you start there, communication gets clear and how you message your own self, how you not only do things intrinsically, but also how you work with the world. So from there, we use Kolbe as our cognitive tool. It's actually the only cognitive tool out there. And so Kathy Kolbe created it a while ago. And so we use the Kolbe A index when we work with individuals and small teams so that we really understand how they go about doing things. So the cognitive part of the mind is your natural tendencies, how you naturally go about taking action in a striving environment. So within that, once we know the why, Kolbe for us is the perfect pair, because the 2 of those, you not only know how much energy someone's going to have moving forward, you also can put them in the right seat And there's nothing more fun, at least to us, when you see that aha moment when people are like, how did you know that? Like, that was so weird. And that's what usually happens when we pair those two, because you not only have the motivation and how to speak to them, so you really understand them, but then you pair that with how they naturally go about doing things, and you avoid burnout. You really can achieve peak performance for a long period of time.
Excellent. That was a perfect summary. Thank you so much, Kelley. So I'm going to move across. I don't know how you guys are seeing the board, but I see Nicole right below Kelley. So Kelley, so Nicole, I'm going to ask you to talk next because you're a master certified disc trainer, and the whole reason we're together today is because Gina up in the right-hand corner had a question about how do we map the disc to the Y. So tell us how you use it, and then we'll answer Gina's question so that she comes away from this with an answer that makes sense.
Sure. Well, we definitely want it to make sense. And I've worked a lot on that, Gina, just so you know. It's not necessarily an easy task. But with DISC is not personality. It's not IQ. It's not skill. DISC is really how the outside world hears and observes your communication style. So I like to use the example of, gosh, if all 5 of us were on a team, I have to assume that all 5 of us speak a different language. Dan, you speak Greek. Kelley, you speak Russian. Gina, Spanish. James, French. And then maybe me, English. Well, somewhere in there, even if we're pantomiming, we can figure out to some degree the message. But when you have distinctively different languages of communication being used, there's misinterpretations of someone's maybe agenda or the true meaning behind how they're saying something. And that becomes really cathartic in some ways. And I kind of think of myself in helping people understand DISC as a bridge builder. Because in communication, if we're not constantly building those bridges of better and stronger understanding, then we have all sorts of, let's say, chaos and misunderstanding happening, especially when it comes to a team. So I help people look at, hey, what are you as a natural communicator? How were you born into the world, and how did you learn how to communicate in your formative years? And then we all have an adaptive communicator style, and that adaptive style, I hope you don't hear what's going on in the background. That adapted style is really subconsciously, we've told ourselves over our lifetime, hey, I've noticed when I'm in a prolonged state of focus, a prolonged state of tension or stress, that if I communicate in this adaptive, this different way, things go better. It may not be true, but we all have those switches from natural to adaptive. So it's really helping open people's eyes to how the outside world is receiving the message and how they can learn to adapt to the people in front of them instead of just going into their natural way of communicating.
And I love that you brought up the different languages. We've really talked about that as a group at the Y Institute recently, because if you're a challenge and you talk challenge language to somebody who's right way, you might as well be speaking a foreign language, because what you're talking about doesn't make sense to them, and they don't want to hear things said that way. So it's great that you brought that up. So I'll let Gina, do you have any comments on what Nicole had to say? Because you originated this conversation when you asked us about mapping the DISC to the Y.
Well, I would go even further, that it's not just that you're speaking a different language, you're actually speaking an opposite language. And if you don't know how to communicate with someone who has a very different profile to you, you can actually become antagonistic towards each other. Yes. So rather than having a successful creative collaboration, you can end up getting really angry with each other because your communication styles, your DISC profiles almost end up violating their values, their norms, the rules by which they live in normal society. Now, just for those who haven't been exposed to DISC in the past, I'm going to summarize what I know of as DISC, and please, Nicole, correct me if I'm wrong, because I've just picked this up over the years. I haven't had formal DISC training like you have. But my understanding is that effectively, if you think about people sitting into 4 different quadrants in their lifestyle, the Ds tend to sit on the dominant side. They're the people who make strong decisions. They want results. Is are influencers. They tend to be about ideas. They tend to be about creativity. They just want to figure things out and solve problems, but they're more like the idea solve problems than they actually put it into reality and structure, which is where the S's come in. Now, S, I believe in the past has stood for steady, relator, But there are people who they like structure, but they also like harmony. And it's really important for S's to be able to collaborate with each other, to feel like they're making progress by supporting elements of what they do. And then lastly, the C's are the conscientious. But if you think like an accountant or a C-level executive, those are people who really love to dot the I's and cross the T's. And for them, consistency and coherence are very, very important, because without that structure, they kind of feel like the world doesn't have an anchor. So you can see what I find really interesting about the DISC profiles, and often people observe this in themselves, is if there are elements which are in conflict with each other, it's really hard not only to communicate, but to understand. I found from personal experience that I sit in the I, the influencer type of bucket naturally, but I also crave structure. And that element of myself, because they're on opposite sides of the quadrants, they kind of juxtapose with each other. And so what you find is that sometimes the I in me is rallying with my S, and I'm like, but I want structure. I'm like, but I don't need the structure. And so it's interesting to observe that the behavioral challenges aren't just with opposite types of people, but they're with opposite types of behaviors in yourself.
Yeah, great points. And thanks for defining those. Go ahead, Nicole.
Let's complicate it further. You mentioned the quadrants, and let's say there's D in one quadrant, I in one quadrant, etc. But looming in the background all the time, when I can observe your I behavioral traits, D, S, and C, you have all three of those too in different percentages. Those are looming in the background, and they have a direct relationship on how much I can observe in your communication. So if you have a lot of C naturally, that C is pulling that I down a little bit, because I'm also able to observe more of the C tendencies. And then if you don't have a lot of the S and D, they're pushing that I and that C forward. So there's actually, if you go around the quadrant, there are 12 interwoven, interrelated styles happening in the background at all times. I mean, that's why human communication can get so difficult, because it's not just one style and it's not just two, it's 12.
I love what you said too, because you notice Nicole's why is challenged, but her how is clarified. And we've noticed too that our how sometimes shows up even more strongly than our why, because that's how we do things. And Nicole said, hey, let me clarify some things for you. And she did a great job of that. So our last person we want to hear from is James. James, you really blew me away, because when we started talking about why, you started talking about how you use core values index and how the why really gave you language for what you find out with CVI. So I'd love to hear more about that, because you're our only CVI person on the panel.
Yeah, thank you. Dan, what I noticed is in my practice, the model that I use starts with awareness and assessment, right? It's kind of I call it waking up and then assessing where you are in the world, understanding what energizes and what drains you. And the CVI really gets to this core, unchanging, innate wiring, DNA. It's all about, again, what energizes and what drains you as a person. So it starts with you first. And then the next phase for me is to talk about the approach and the action that you need to take to get a different result in your life, right? And so what I was naturally doing was coaching a why process that I learned from Simon, which was through stories and trends and like how do you contribute and things like that. And that was taking a lot of time. Because I'm a better way person, when I met you and you said you can get to that in 5 minutes and you can have your whole operating system, I said you have me at why. And so for me, it really helps. The YOS really helps to communicate a better approach in a way that others can understand it, and you can articulate why, how, and what. And so that's kind of how I use those together, because then through action you ascend. And then you just continue to go around that circle of awareness through ascension and action. And so that's what I love about the why, is it gives a really, I call it the strategic roadmap, customized roadmap to be able to understand and articulate to the world basically how you go to market, if you use those terms.
Yeah, and that's perfect, because a lot of the times the coaches we work with or the clients we work with are looking for a way to express themselves, right? Simon taught us a long time ago. He said, hey, if you tell people what you believe, you're going to attract people that believe what you believe. So when we lead with our why, how, and what, this is why I do what I do. How I do it is by clarifying, and what I do is make sense. Nicole, you're attracting people that want to be challenged, that want clarity, and that wants somebody to help them make sense of whatever it is they're struggling with, right? And so you're going to attract those people with the message that you put out if you put it out correctly. So that's a great point that you just brought up, James. So let's get to your original question, Gina. So you tried to map the DISC quadrants to the different whys, and you and Nicole have had some conversations. Tell me where you ended up. I know you even have a picture you wanted to show. So tell us where you found them. Oh, you're muted, Gina. We have to unmute Gina.
There you go. Sorry about that. First of all, what I overlap the DISC profile with the color wheel. So like Nicole was saying, there's 12 different elements that go in here. But what I've also tried to do, and the colors don't reflect this necessarily, is try to overlap the 9 whys with the behavior of people. It's a mess, right? Because as humans, we're complicated. Right. And that's effectively it. But what I did manage to figure out is that I could very easily put myself and the behavior traits that I see in myself on the DISC profile, because it's easy, because you can identify it. But when I'm not familiar with the trait, so for example, I struggle with clarify, although I like better way and I like to make sense. Clarify is almost like drilling down, asking questions until you get the nugget of what you're asking for, right? And I also struggle with simplify, because I want to create all of these crazy ideas, but how do I distill them into the core essence? So for me, it was hard to map those items onto it. And what I ended up doing, and with Dan's help as well, because he had a look at these too, is effectively we ended up with simplify and clarify down here in the C quadrant, which is, as I said, the I dotters and the T crossers. Now, I see that we've got some questions. Oh, is this right? Is this right? And this is exactly why I think the mapping Y to the DISC profile is so challenging, because we are humans, we are complicated, messy beings, but also we tend to identify attributes in ourselves, which is exactly why we're exploring other people's whys. And the strength of the why isn't necessarily just an understanding why we do what we do, that compelling moment that makes me go, oh my God, now I know why I behave the way I behave. It's also about understanding, as I said previously with DISC, when you're in contrast with people. And so I'd actually love to go and figure out why we've got some disagreement with Nicole there in the corner, because she's obviously found some contradictions in this. And that's the point, right? How do we make sense of these different facets of identifying if this is the thing that drives you, where in the DISC profile are you actually sitting? And more importantly, what do we have in common that allows us to see results rather than what we have that separates us or divides us? And how can we create a complex, full, robust team where we're almost looking for people who have the strength that we know that we lack?
Perfect. So Nicole, I'm going to let you answer. And one of the things that's really cool, and I think that's why you guys are meshing so well, is you guys should share a couple of your top 3. Gina's Makes Sense, Challenge, Better Way. Nicole, your challenge, Clarify, Makes Sense. So you want to make sense of things ultimately. Gina wants to start there. So what did you have to add?
Well, I'm going to challenge you both as a challenger on this one. Clarify definitively, if I had to pick one style, I'd say C. However, some of your descriptors also mesh with I's and S's. And when I started, what I had to do is I had to back away and I had to just look at your descriptors and then look at the DISC descriptors, the adjectives. And I started matching them side by side. And that's how I got to so many of these are really a blend. Simplify, I have is D and S. And let me tell you why. D's, I'm a screaming high D. I don't want the detail. Like if you give me too much detail, my eyes are going to glass over anyway, right? I'm not going to hear you, but I want it simple. If I'm going to explain something as a D, I'm giving you bullet points or I'm barking orders. Right. I'm not going into all the detail. So I kind of question whether simplify wouldn't be definitely a D tendency and some S, because S's also do not like complicated stuff. They want to be able to follow a organized system. And they want things really steady. So I say simplify is DS and clarify is potentially CIS.
Okay.
Could be wrong.
Gina, does that make sense to you?
Sorry, I'm just going to leave myself off mute. So if you hear rustling in the background, because it's takes too long to turn mute off and on. Yeah, you can see I am making sense of this as we literally go around it. And in fact, it does make sense because that also it also collates with the information that I've got previously, which is effectively you can put one of the whys in almost 3 of the buckets. And what I've identified actually is that it seems as if there are only certain characteristic traits that are opposed to one of the whys, rather than character traits that are in common. So effectively, if we think of it as an elimination process, because there's a little bit of an element of simplify in me as well, right?
Yeah.
If you think of it as an elimination process, it's almost like assume that every character trait wants to align with 3 of them, or every Y wants to align with 3 of the disc profiles, but there's one that it just doesn't sit very well with.
Yeah.
So for example, makes sense in my experience, and Nicole, you may disagree with me, is it doesn't sit well with the C, because the C is not about making sense from a bigger picture perspective. They're about simplifying and clarifying. So from that perspective, that Y doesn't sit there because the other elements sit there instead. So effectively what I've done now is added complexity, but in order to simplify, I've actually stripped out and rather gone, if you sit anywhere in these 3, you've got all of them, right? But if you sit in this one, you're going to be in opposition with someone who doesn't have that. What makes sense to me about that is actually when we talk about communication styles and we talk about the ability of people to collaborate in a work environment or a context where they really want to get on well with people, they want to drive results and they want to do it in a way that makes them feel good, what they need to be able to do is identify commonalities between them. So actually, this brings a real sense of enlightenment, but also a sense of calm, because it means that we have more in common than separates us. Yeah. And if we're able to look at that one thing where we oppose each other, we can then stretch out into the other aspects of the profile that allows us to see things from someone else's point of view.
Love that. Thank you so much, Gina. I'm glad that worked out. So Kelley, I know one of the things that Gina brought up is how we can work with those opposites. And I know when we use Kolbe in conjunction with the Y, you get a really full picture of people. Do you guys see that in your practice? When you work with teams, helping them understand the opposite ends of the spectrum?
Yeah, definitely. And I think a big part of this is the order in which these things are in, right? So the why of right way is very different than the how of right way. And understanding the difference in those tendencies and what the strengths and potential obstacles are is really, really crucial, because then how you map that onto the other side is also going to be really important. So my why of right way, Bailey, who's a team member of ours, her how is right way. And we go about things very differently. And so that's where having Kolbe come in and say, okay, me as a 9-7 in those, so those are initiating trends, which means that's how I naturally go about doing things the strongest, is that I need a lot of information and I need to put that information into order. And if I can't do that, I'm probably not going to move. Like, it's just not going to happen.
Right.
So that's a C tendency for sure.
Yeah. So knowing that is so important. And so when we did Dan's, for example, we know his why, how, what, but then also from the Kolbe side, knowing that he is the exact opposite of me in pretty much all of those regards, gives us this bridge. So instead of just hitting heads like this and saying, is he undermining me? Like, why is he crashing all of my systems? Or why am I putting him in a box? We don't think like that. We understand the strengths and the value that each person plays so that we can play our positions the best. And it ends up making a great team.
Yeah. And I love that you said that, because it really is about understanding that people like me that are going to be quick starts and come up with a lot of ideas need somebody like Kelley to grab those ideas and put them in order and say, this is what we do with them, so that we can actually execute on all those great ideas. And we have a better way too here in James. So James, does that make sense to you as you talk about CVI and the why? Do you see yourself using the different elements to bring the opposites together in the teams you work with?
Yeah, and I don't call them opposites, I call them complementary, because in a team you need all of them to perform. So opposite kind of thinks like we have conflict, but when you complement and you have them all in the team, you have all of them, the team can perform at its best and highest. And so the way I use CVI is, if you think about it, it's like, what is the motivator behind why you show up as the why, how, and what that you do? And when you understand that, that has to do with, does this energize me or drain me? And what's the approach I take to getting things done? Like Kelley talked, what is my approach? It's because I'm motivated, for example, by love and relationship. So when it comes to Better Way, it's an inspired vision of how people should be and what they can be. Therefore, I'm super excited about a better way. And then I want to explain it to people. So I simplify it. My other core value is innovator wisdom. So I think of creative ways to come up to explain it so people get it. So I can see how the CVI is kind of the why underneath the approach that I take, which is my YOS. And that's why I love it.
I love that. So there's a couple of comments that in the chat that I want to address. One is from Eileen. She asked, do we think the why discovery needs a supplemental assessment? And then, of course, Gary had a great answer. He says, the why alone is one dimension. When you do the why, how, and what, you get a third dimension. But when you add another assessment, you get that fourth dimension. You really get that depth. And I think we've seen that whether you're using Kolbe DISC or Core Values Index, it gives you that fourth dimension. And you really get to understand the person that you're talking to at a totally different level. So Kelley and Jerry have figured that out. Nicole has figured that out. James has finally figured it out. He's just joining us, but this is really cool. So I'm going to do something fun because believe it or not, we're at the end of our time. But I'm going to ask you guys a question because I recently had this happen with a coach. He is a coach, and he was working with a team where 80% of the leadership team was Better Way. So I'm going to challenge you guys to tell me what would happen if you had a leadership team where everybody was Better Way, James. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. I'm going to go all the way around and say, what do you think would happen?
The best absolute possible outcome would happen, Dan. Everybody's Better Way. They're going to be permanently dissatisfied. There's never a situation that can't be solved. They can never be defeated, and they will just achieve beyond their wildest dreams. Better Way, all the way.
All right. Oh, I like that answer. So we're not gonna debate it. We're just gonna allow you to answer. Okay, Nicole. What if you had a team that was you had an executive team with 5 challenges? What would that be like?
Well, for me as a challenger, I would have a real problem with that.
Yeah.
One, the strongest teams have the most diversity among the styles. And I'm actually in the midst of working with a client where everyone is almost the same profile. Yeah. And I'm like, whew, if I walked in, this would be a problem. So Better Way, I would think, at least from my perspective, perhaps I would perceive those individuals as always trying to box me into a certain way of doing things. And maybe they'd even be changing things more often than I'd want to, depending on my profile, always looking for that better way when maybe I just want things to be steady. Can we just like pick something and stick with it? So I think it could change depending on what the other profiles are, but everyone all one profile usually, not always, but usually is not your best way to go.
Yeah, and that's why I brought that up. Kelley, what if we had a team full of right ways? What do you think? How would that team function?
We'd just have analysis paralysis. We would just go round and round in circles saying my process is better and I'm not following yours. So no, nothing would complement each other. So you need those ideas mixed in so that ideas and implementation can balance each other out.
Excellent answer. What about you, Gina? What if you had a room full of make senses and you guys had to run a company?
But we'd never get anything done. We'd spend all of our time figuring out the ins and outs, and we never have anyone who could actually execute it. We never had anyone who could actually put it into frameworks, and we never have anyone who could actually just deliver. So I think make senses are great, and we enjoy each other's company, and we solve all sorts of crazy ass world problems, right? But if it was just us, we'd spend all of our time talking and not actually.
That reminds me so much of our first conversation, Gina, because I think we solved all the world's problems when we were talking and we found a time to meet. So, James, I think would you change your answer now? Because this Dale Carnegie coach, that's one of our coaches, that's exactly what he found. He found an executive team that had 80% better ways. And that's what he said. They said everybody had a better idea and they never could settle on the best one. And they're almost trying to one-up each other. So you need somebody to kind of bring them together. It's great to brainstorm. It's great to have all those ideas. But you need your right way people. You need your clarifiers to kind of say, okay, where do we stop the brainstorming and start the executing? And that's why Kelley is such a valuable member of our team when we kind of tend to go all challenge Better Way and on her. And she says, okay, what can we do, guys? And that's a great point. James?
Yeah, absolutely. Any strength overextended becomes a weakness. So if you have all of one type, you're going to be weak. So I totally agree. Better ways would never land the plane. They would always be talking about better ways because it's energizing to think of the better way. That goes to the core value of wisdom. And so you need the mix of everybody to have the strongest team. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I'm going to answer my own question. If you had a board full of contributors, we'd give everything away. We'd never make any money because we would just want to help everyone, right? And everybody thinks it's such a great why, and it is. All the whys are great, and I love being a contributor. But if I'm left to my own devices, literally, let's do everything for free. Let's help as many people as we can. And before you know it, your company's broke. So you need somebody to say, okay, how do we monetize that? How do we put systems in place? This has been great. I'm going to give everybody a chance to give one final thought. Anything that I haven't asked? What did I forget to ask? Anybody, raise your hand and I'll call on you. All right, Nicole.
Okay. One other thing as I was going through this, because with DISC, the priorities are different. So it's either a task priority or a people focus. Let's say focus instead of priority. And what I noticed with the 9 whys is that there, to me, seemed to be way more task focused whys than people focused. And maybe that's just my interpretation, but I think offline, we should have like a brainstorming session and really put a lot of these things, including pace, into the mix and see what we come up with. I think it could be really fascinating.
So what you don't know, Nicole, is that even though it's just me here, Bailey's in the background, and she definitely wrote that down, and you're going to get a phone call, and you're going to be invited to a brainstorming session. So that's great. Thank you so much, Nicole. Anyone else? Gina, any final thoughts?
I think a lot of these profiles are useful in your ability to understand yourself and your team, but understanding only goes so far. At the end of the day, we have to take action based on the lessons that we've learned. And the important thing is that particularly in times of stress or in times of conflict, we tend to act out of the behaviors that are common for us or that are normal or that we default to. The challenge with any steps of understanding is how do we then take that knowledge and apply it, particularly in circumstances where there are trying times. And look, at the end of the day, isn't any organization or any group of people or any individual who wants to achieve more out of their life really trying to apply that in a way that makes a difference? So whatever your why is, the important thing is to understand that you cannot exist in isolation, but also you need to be able to step away and apply some kind of level, whether that is you're the kind of profile who needs to apply empathy when you wouldn't normally, or you would apply knowledge when you wouldn't normally, or you want to apply insightfulness when you wouldn't normally. Effectively be comfortable with the fact that you are not that kind of personality and appreciate the value that someone else does bring, particularly if they see the world in a different way to you.
I love that you brought it back to action, because I just listened to Darren Hardy this morning. That's what he said. Look, if it was all about knowledge, we have the internet. We would all be billionaires and we'd all be running multi-billion-dollar companies if it was just about knowledge. The information is there. It's what you do with that information. I think that's a great point to end on. So Nicole, James, Gina, Kelley, thank you so much for being on. I know that there were a lot of people that were listening and we had some comments. We're also going to record this. So this is going to reside on our LinkedIn page. It's going to reside on our YouTube page. So you guys can go back. Please share it with people. I really appreciate everybody who came on today, especially Gina, who's coming to us from the future, from tomorrow. She's already at Thursday. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you guys at the end of June.
Thank you.